The chamber went silent the moment the final vote appeared on the floating screen above us. 41 lights turned green, 2 turned red. My own light was green, and I did not feel proud of it, though I told myself I should. I am Veskar, third-rank attaché of the Threnody Concord, and I had spent 6 years preparing for this exact moment without ever believing it would come. The motion on the table was simple in its wording and enormous in its weight. The immediate and total banishment of the species known as humanity from all Concord space, all Concord trade, and all Concord protection. I looked down at the human delegation as the numbers settled. There were only 3 of them in the chamber, seated at a table built for beings twice their height, in chairs that did not fit them, under lighting tuned for eyes that were not theirs. I expected panic. I expected the young translator on their left to tremble, or the older woman in the center to rise and beg for a delay, an appeal, anything. Instead, the woman in the center, whose name I would later learn was Laura Bennett, folded her hands on the table and looked up at the council with an expression I did not have a word for yet. It was not fear. It was not defiance. It was something closer to relief, wrapped so tightly in patience that it barely showed at all. "Chairperson," she said, in that flat human way of speaking that always sounded too calm for the situation. "Before this session closes, I would like the ruling delivered in writing, with full signatures from every voting member, within the next planetary rotation." The chairperson, a broad-shouldered thrall named Odrin Vass, blinked all 4 of his eyes at once, which for his species was the equivalent of surprise. "You are not going to contest the vote?" "No," Laura said. "We accept it." A murmur ran through the chamber, the kind that spreads faster than sound should be able to travel in an open room. I felt it too, a small twist somewhere behind my ribs that I did not understand yet. Species that lose everything do not usually thank the ones who took it from them. They argue, they threaten, they weep. Humanity did none of these things. They asked for paperwork. I had been assigned to the Earth file 11 months earlier, back when humanity was still considered a minor irritation rather than a genuine problem. My task had been small and almost boring. Monitor trade disputes, track minor treaty violations, write quarterly summaries that no one above me actually read. Humanity, at the time, was a single system with a handful of colonies, a species that had only been part of galactic society for 2 decades, still finding its footing among older, larger, more established powers. But somewhere in those 11 months, the quiet irritation had grown into something the council called a crisis. Reports came in from 3 different sectors describing the same pattern: human traders undercutting established markets not through force, but through impossibly efficient logistics. Human engineers redesigning shared infrastructure so cleanly that client species began preferring human contractors over Concord-approved ones. Human musicians, human recipes, human stories, spreading through populations that had never shown interest in outside culture before. None of it was illegal. That was the maddening part. Every contract humanity signed was airtight. Every trade deal followed Concord law to the letter, and yet somehow, within 20 years, humanity had gone from a curiosity to a competitor, and competitors made the older powers nervous in ways that violations never had. The formal charges read aloud before the vote had been almost comedic in their vagueness. Unsanctioned expansion, cultural contamination of client species, refusal to disarm military assets following first contact protocol. I remember reading the 3rd charge and thinking it was the only one with any teeth, and even that one felt thin. Humanity had never attacked anyone. They had simply refused to hand over their defense fleet for voluntary Concord oversight, which was a polite way of saying they refused to give up their only leverage. I had voted green. I told myself it was because the council had decided, and my vote was a formality within a body that had already made up its mind days before the session opened. I told myself it did not matter what I believed personally. I have thought about that vote many times since, and I no longer believe the excuse I gave myself that day. After the vote closed, I was assigned, almost as a punishment, to oversee the legal drafting of the banishment terms. My superior, a tired old Koruvan administrator named Thessa Orn, handed me the assignment with a kind of weary sympathy. "You get to write the words that end them," she said. "Congratulations." I did not feel congratulated. I felt the way one feels after signing a document too quickly. sensing a mistake somewhere in the fine print, but unable to locate it. The drafting process took 4 rotations. The final ruling, once complete, ran to nearly 600 pages, dense with clauses about buoy placement, communication blackout timelines, trade route closures, and enforcement protocols. It was, by Concord standards, a thorough and unambiguous document. Humanity would be sealed behind a quarantine network within 30 days. No ships in, no ships out. No communication beyond a single emergency channel reserved for medical emergencies only. Every treaty humanity had ever signed with the Concord would be dissolved the moment the ruling took effect. I expected the human legal team to spend their appeal window fighting the ruling clause by clause. Species facing expulsion always did. They argued jurisdiction. They argued procedure. They dragged proceedings out for months, sometimes years, hoping for a change in council composition or a shift in political winds. Humanity did not do this. Instead, their legal team, led by a sharp, quiet man named Daniel Carter, requested full access to the draft ruling and spent the entire appeal window doing something none of us anticipated. They read it. All 600 pages, cross-referenced against 300 years of Concord Treaty law, annotated line by line, and returned to us not with objections, but with confirmations. I remember the exact moment the first confirmation arrived on my terminal. It was a short message, formal in tone, acknowledging receipt of Clause 412, which stated that the banishment ruling would immediately and permanently void all prior treaties between Earth and the Concord, including all military restriction agreements signed during the first contact period. Humanity had confirmed, in writing, that they understood this clause perfectly. They had not objected to it. They had, if anything, seemed pleased by it. I brought this to Thessa's attention, thinking it might be a translation error, or a misunderstanding on their end. She read the message twice, then looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. "They know exactly what that clause means," she said slowly. "They wanted it in there. Why would anyone want to lose their treaties? Because those treaties were the only thing keeping their military fleet under our oversight," she said. "Read the rest of what they sent." I did. Clause after clause, humanity confirmed understanding, confirmed acceptance, and in several cases, suggested minor rewording that made the language even clearer, even more absolute. They were not fighting the ruling, they were sharpening it. By the end of the appeal window, it had become clear to everyone working on the draft that humanity was not being banished against its will in any meaningful sense. They were walking through an open door that the council had built for them, thanking us for holding it, and closing it gently behind themselves on their way out. I raised this concern in a private meeting with 3 other members of the legal drafting team. I said, plainly, that something about this did not sit right with me. Species facing total isolation from galactic trade and protection do not thank the body that isolates them. They do not use their final days of legal access to make the ruling against them more precise. Something was happening that none of us fully understood, and I did not like operating in the dark. One of my colleagues, a younger ITHRA clerk named Pell, laughed at my concern. "Maybe they are simply being dignified about their loss," she said. "Not every species screams when it falls." I wanted to believe her. I did not. 2 days before the ruling was set to take effect, I was granted a final meeting with the human delegation, a formality required before any major Concord ruling was executed. I expected Laura Bennett to attend, perhaps with Daniel Carter beside her. Instead, I was met by a woman I had not seen before, introduced simply as Grace Whitfield, described only as a liaison for what she called post-ruling logistics. Grace was younger than Laura, with a calm, easy manner that reminded me of someone attending a routine business meeting, rather than the final hours before her entire species was cut off from the wider galaxy. "You seem troubled, Ambassador Veskar," she said, before I had spoken a single word. "I am troubled," I admitted, surprising myself with my own honesty. "Your species is being expelled from every trade network, every communication channel, every protective agreement we have ever offered, and you are behaving as though we have done you a favor." Grace considered this for a long moment, folding her hands the same way Laura had in the council chamber. "Ambassador," she said, "may I ask you something first?" I nodded. "In the 20 years since first contact, Has Earth ever violated a single Concord law? I searched my memory and my files, and I could not produce a single confirmed violation. Every accusation brought against humanity over the years had eventually been dismissed for lack of evidence, or resolved through technicalities that always seemed to favor humanity in ways too clean to be accidental. No, I admitted. Then consider this, Grace said. A species that follows every rule perfectly for 20 years, while still growing faster than anyone expected, is not a species that broke the law. It is a species that read the law more carefully than anyone else in this room. I did not have a response to that. I still do not, fully, even now. She rose to leave, gathering nothing, since she had brought nothing with her, not even the physical copies of documents that other delegations always carried. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "You will see the shape of it soon enough," she said. "We are not asking you to trust us. We are only asking you to keep watching." The doors closed behind her, and I stood alone in the meeting room for a long time, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, feeling for the first time since the vote that I had been present for something far larger than a simple political ruling. 30 days passed in a strange, tense quiet. The quarantine buoy network was constructed exactly as specified, a ring of automated stations forming a perimeter around the human home system and its scattered colonies. Communication channels were shut down one by one, trade routes closed, embassy staff recalled. I watched it happen from a monitoring station 3 sectors away, reading status updates as they scrolled past on my terminal, each one a small, clean confirmation that humanity had been successfully, legally, and permanently cut off from the rest of the galaxy. On the morning the final buoy activated, sealing the perimeter completely, I expected silence. I expected humanity to disappear from our awareness, the way isolated species usually did, fading into irrelevance behind a wall no one could see through. Instead, less than 6 hours after the perimeter closed, a single object appeared on long-range sensors, sitting exactly on the quarantine boundary, neither crossing in nor retreating out. It was a ship, according to the initial reports, though its design did not match anything in our records. It broadcast no aggressive signals. It made no attempt to breach the line. It simply sat there, calm and still, on an open channel, waiting. I remember staring at the sensor feed for a long time before I finally understood what I was looking at. Humanity had not vanished behind the wall we built for them. They had sent something to stand at the edge of it, in plain sight, and wait for us to notice. I did not know yet what that ship was for, or what it meant, or why its presence made the back of my neck feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I only knew, standing there watching the feed with the rest of the monitoring staff gathered silently behind me, that something had shifted, quietly and permanently, and none of us had been given the chance to vote on it. Thessa Orn found me still watching the feed an hour later. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside me and stared at the same still, patient ship sitting on the boundary line. "They wanted this," she said finally, echoing what she had told me weeks earlier during the drafting process. "All of it. The vote, the ruling, the wall. They wanted every piece of it exactly as it happened." "Why would anyone want to be banished?" I asked, though I already suspected the beginning of an answer. Thessa did not look away from the screen. "Because a wall, built by someone else's hands, following someone else's laws, cannot be argued with later. It cannot be called an act of aggression. It cannot be challenged in any court. They did not need to win the vote, Veskar. They only needed us to cast it." I thought about Grace Whitfield's words in that quiet meeting room. "You will see the shape of it soon enough." I looked at the still, patient shape on the sensor feed, sitting exactly where it had chosen to sit, and I understood, with a growing unease I could not shake, that we had only seen the very beginning of it. The ship on the boundary line did not move for 3 full days. I know this because I watched it, along with half the monitoring staff at the sector outpost, take turns refusing to leave their stations. There was something about its stillness that pulled at people, the way an unanswered question pulls at the mind long after the conversation has moved on. It did not power its weapons, if it had any. It did not attempt to breach the buoy line. It simply sat there, broadcasting a single open channel that repeated the same short message on a loop, spoken in a calm, unhurried voice I did not recognize. This is the Earth vessel Steadfast, holding position at the designated boundary. We are not crossing the line. We are only making certain everyone can see it clearly. I did not understand the message the first time I heard it. I did not understand it the 10th time either. It was Thessa who finally said what I had been too slow to notice. They are not hiding anything, she said, watching the feed over my shoulder. Look at how they are broadcasting. Full sensor telemetry, open for anyone to read. Every system status, every movement, all public. She was right. I pulled up the raw data stream myself and confirmed it. The Steadfast was transmitting its own internal diagnostics on an unencrypted channel, visible to any receiver within range. Weapon status, reported inactive. Shield status, reported at standby. Engine output, reported at minimum. It was, in effect, standing in the open with its hands raised, showing everyone exactly what it was and was not doing, and daring anyone watching to find a contradiction. I had never seen a species behave this way during a period of conflict. Every prior standoff I had studied in my training involved concealment, misdirection, feints designed to confuse an opponent about true capability. Humanity was doing the opposite. They were removing every possible excuse for anyone to claim they had been threatened. On the 4th day, the Council convened an emergency session to discuss the ship's presence. I was called to attend as a technical advisor, given my prior work on the drafting team. The chamber was tense in a way I had not felt since the original banishment vote, though this time the tension carried a different flavor, closer to confusion than certainty. "It has made no aggressive move," said a meal representative named Orsa Thil, reading from a prepared statement. "It has not crossed the boundary. It has not attempted communication beyond its looped message. By any reasonable standard, it is not in violation of the ruling." "Then why does it unsettle every officer who watches it?" asked another delegate, a sharp-voiced Koru van named Braskiloon. "A ship that sits still and says nothing threatening should not feel like a threat, and yet it does." I found myself, unexpectedly, called upon to answer that question. I stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber, and said the only honest thing I could think of. "It unsettles us," I said, "because we do not understand what it is for. We have spent generations reading intent through aggression. A raised weapon tells us to be afraid. A closed channel tells us to be suspicious. This ship gives us neither, and so we do not know how to read it. That, I believe, is precisely the point." The chamber fell quiet at that, and I sat back down feeling as though I had said something true, without fully understanding why it mattered. It was during this same emergency session that the first reports began arriving from client species along the outer trade routes, reports that would occupy far more of my attention in the days that followed than the still, patient ship on the boundary line ever did. The Ithra homeworld reported unusual activity among its youth population, a sudden surge in unauthorized cultural imports discovered during routine customs inspection. Books, recorded music, recipes for foods that did not exist anywhere in Ithra cuisine. All of it traced back to human origin, all of it moving through channels that should have been completely severed by the quarantine. The meal reported something similar, though framed in more clinical terms. Agricultural researchers had discovered seed stock in several regional co-ops that matched genetic markers for human-engineered crop varieties, crops known for extraordinary yield in poor soil conditions. No one could explain how the seeds had arrived, since all shipping lanes to and from Earth had been closed for over a month. The Koru van, usually the most rigid and rule-bound of the 3 client species, reported the strangest case of all. An entire regional medical network had, over the preceding 2 years, quietly integrated human-designed diagnostic software into its hospital systems. When the quarantine took effect, administrators had assumed the software would simply stop functioning, cut off from its origin point. Instead, it continued running flawlessly, entirely self-contained, requiring no outside connection at all. It had been designed, from the very beginning, to work independently, as though its creators had anticipated exactly this scenario long before anyone had spoken the word banishment. I remember reading through these reports late into the night, feeling the same cold unease creeping back into my chest that I had felt watching the Steadfast sit motionless on the boundary line. Every single case followed the same pattern. Something human, embedded quietly, functioning independently, discovered only after the wall had gone up, and in every case, entirely legal. Thessa summoned me to her office 2 days later, holding a data pad in one hand that she set down on the desk between us with unusual force. "Read this," she said. It was a formal petition, filed jointly by representatives of the Ithra, Meal, and Koru Van governments, requesting an emergency review of certain trade clauses within their own individual treaties with the Concord. The clauses in question, buried deep within agreements that had been renegotiated over the preceding decade, granted each species broad protections for what the documents called essential cultural and agricultural goods, defined loosely enough to cover almost anything a population might consider necessary to its way of life. These clauses were renegotiated years ago, Thessa said, long before the banishment vote, long before anyone in this council even considered humanity a serious concern. Renegotiated by whom? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Human trade lawyers, she said, working as neutral consultants for all three species, during a period when Earth was still considered a minor power, with no reason to interfere in anyone else's internal treaty structure. I sat back in my chair, feeling the shape of something enormous begin to take form in my mind, still too large and too distant to see clearly, but undeniably present. They built the exits years in advance, I said slowly, for themselves and for their friends. Thessa nodded. It appears that way. The council spent the following week attempting to close the loophole, drafting emergency amendments meant to restrict the essential goods clauses before they could be used to justify further movement across the quarantine line. Every attempt failed for the same frustrating reason. The clauses had been written with such precision, cross-referenced against so many older treaties, that any amendment broad enough to close the loophole would also unravel a dozen unrelated agreements that the Concord depended on for its own internal stability. I began to understand, slowly and with growing discomfort, that this had likely been the intention from the very beginning. A trap does not need teeth if it is built correctly. It only needs to be shaped so that escaping it costs more than staying inside ever could. During this same period, I was assigned to monitor communications along the quarantine boundary, a task that placed me once again within range of the Steadfast's continuous broadcast. I had grown so used to the looped message that I barely registered it anymore, until one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the ship first appeared, the message changed. "This is the Earth vessel Steadfast," the new recording began, in the same calm voice as before. "We remain at the boundary, as agreed under the terms of the current ruling. We wish to remind all parties that we have not crossed this line, requested no exception, and violated no term of the agreement placed upon us. We ask only that this be remembered, clearly, by everyone who chooses to act in the days ahead." I played the message 4 times, searching for hidden meaning in the careful, deliberate phrasing. It was not a threat. It was not a request. It was, I finally realized, a statement made for the historical record, a marker placed deliberately in the timeline for anyone who might later try to claim humanity had acted first, had broken the agreement, had given anyone a legitimate reason to respond with force. I brought this observation to Thessa, who listened without interrupting, then sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "They are building a record," she said finally. "Not for us, for themselves, and for whoever comes after us. Every word that ship broadcasts is evidence, filed in real time, that whatever happens next was not their doing." "You think they expect something to happen next?" Thessa looked at me with an expression that carried more weight than any answer she could have given in words. "Veskar," she said, "I think they have expected something to happen next, since long before that vote was ever called. I think the vote itself was simply the moment they had been waiting for." I left her office that night and walked the long corridor back toward my own quarters, passing rows of darkened offices where junior staff had already gone home for the evening cycle. I found myself thinking, unwillingly, about Grace Whitfield's parting words in that quiet meeting room weeks earlier. "You will see the shape of it soon enough. We are only asking you to keep watching." I had been watching, and the shape I was beginning to see frightened me more than any weapon ever could, precisely because it did not look like a weapon at all. It looked like patience, applied with such precision over so many years that by the time anyone noticed it, there was no longer anything left to do but watch it finish taking form. 3 days later, The first client fleet crossed the quarantine boundary without authorization, and everything the council thought it understood about the situation changed completely. The first crossing happened at a small trade checkpoint on the outer edge of Meal territory, and it happened so quietly that the council did not learn of it until nearly 6 hours after the fact. A cargo convoy, registered to a Meal agricultural cooperative, requested passage through the quarantine boundary, carrying what its manifest described as essential seed stock, destined for a drought relief effort on a neighboring colony. The automated buoy stationed at that section of the perimeter flagged the request for review, as it was designed to do, and forwarded it to the nearest staffed monitoring post for a decision. The officer on duty, a young Ithra named Pell, the same clerk who had once laughed at my early concerns during the drafting process, approved the crossing without escalating it further up the chain of command. When questioned later, she explained that the manifest matched precisely with the essential goods clause buried in the Meal Treaty renegotiation, the same clause I had already flagged weeks earlier as a likely point of exploitation. She had followed procedure exactly as written. There was nothing improper in her decision. That was, in fact, the entire problem. By the time the council convened to discuss the crossing, 4 more convoys had already followed the same path, each one carrying different cargo, each one justified under a different clause buried somewhere within the client species treaties: seeds, medical supplies, educational materials for youth programs. Every single crossing was, on paper, completely legal. I was called before the council again, this time not as a technical advisor, but as something closer to a witness, expected to explain how a quarantine designed to be absolute had developed so many quiet exits within its first month of operation. These clauses were approved by this very council, I said, standing before the assembled delegates, feeling the same weight of attention I had felt during the earlier session, years before the banishment vote, during a period when no one considered Earth capable of exploiting them. The clauses are not violations of the ruling. They are conditions the ruling itself failed to account for. Then close them, said Braskilun, the sharp-voiced Koruvan delegate, his patience visibly thinning. Draft an emergency amendment and close every loophole before this quarantine becomes meaningless. We have tried, I said. Every version of the amendment we draft either fails to close the loophole completely or unravels other treaties this council depends on for stability among the client species. There is no clean solution. Whoever wrote these clauses understood that a clean solution would not exist. The chamber erupted into overlapping arguments, delegates from different species accusing one another of negligence, of secret sympathy toward humanity, of failing to properly review agreements that had been sitting in plain sight for years. I stood quietly through most of it, feeling less like a diplomat and more like someone watching a structure slowly discover it had been built on unstable ground, long after the foundation had already been poured. It was during this same chaotic session that new reports began arriving, each one more difficult to contain than the last. Enforcement vessels dispatched to intercept the unauthorized crossings found their targeting systems behaving erratically the moment they approached the boundary line too closely. Not disabled entirely, but degraded, sluggish, prone to strange errors that no engineer could immediately explain. A senior Threll officer named Odrin Vass, the same chairperson who had presided over the original banishment vote, brought this issue directly to my attention, since I had become, somewhat unwillingly, the closest thing the council had to an expert on human behavior. "Explain this," he said, showing me a diagnostic report from one of the affected vessels. "Our fleet's targeting array has never failed in this manner before. It simply stops functioning correctly whenever we approach that boundary, then resumes normal operation the moment we retreat." I studied the report carefully, cross-referencing the component manufacturer listed in the technical specifications. My chest tightened as I recognized the name, a mid-tier engineering firm that had, over the preceding 15 years, quietly won an enormous share of Concord infrastructure contracts by offering components at prices no other supplier could match. "This firm is human-owned," I said slowly. "Or was, until recently. It appears to have transferred ownership through several intermediary companies before eventually landing under full human control, likely without triggering any review process, since the transfers were spread out over years and structured to stay below every reporting threshold." Odrin Vass stared at me, his 4 eyes narrowing in a way I had come to associate with genuine alarm, rather than mere surprise. "You are telling me our own military fleet is running on components secretly controlled by the species we just banished?" "I am telling you," I said carefully, "that a significant portion of Concord infrastructure, across multiple sectors, appears to have been quietly built using human-designed technology, purchased legally, installed legally, and now, apparently, behaving in ways that were never disclosed in any specification we were given." "Sabotage," Odrin said flatly. "No," I said, and I found myself surprised by how confident I felt saying it. If this were sabotage, our fleet would have stopped functioning entirely. Instead, it appears to be reverting to what the specifications call a safe operating mode, whenever it approaches an active conflict boundary. That is not an attack. That is a built-in limitation, present since installation, that no one thought to question, because it never triggered before now. Odrin said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the report in his hands. "They built failure into their own machines," he said finally, "on purpose, in case a day like this ever came. It appears that way. Why would anyone do that? It weakens their own product. It gives them no advantage in a genuine engagement." I thought about this for longer than I probably should have before answering. "Perhaps," I said slowly, "because they never intended to use it as an advantage in a genuine engagement. Perhaps they built it so that no engagement could happen at all, at least not using anything they had a hand in creating." I did not fully understand the implications of my own words until several days later, when a full technical audit, hastily assembled from engineers across 3 different sectors, confirmed that the pattern extended far beyond the single firm Odrin had first flagged: logistics networks, communication relays, portions of the very buoy system used to enforce the quarantine itself, all of it, to varying degrees, traced back through some chain of ownership or licensing to human origin, and all of it, when tested under simulated conflict conditions, exhibited the same strange, graceful degradation rather than outright failure. It was not a weapon. That was what made it so difficult for the Council to respond to. A weapon could be identified, condemned, defended against. This was something else entirely, something closer to a quiet, patient insurance policy, written into the bones of half the galaxy's infrastructure, years before anyone realized what it might one day be used to prevent. Meanwhile, the Steadfast remained exactly where it had been since its arrival, still broadcasting its calm, careful message on an open channel, still refusing to cross the boundary despite the growing chaos unfolding around it. I found myself returning to that broadcast more and more often during this period, drawn to its stillness the way one is drawn to the only fixed point in an otherwise shifting landscape. On the 9th day following the first unauthorized crossing, I was summoned to a private session with Thessa Orn, along with 2 representatives from the client species whose treaties had proven so troublesome. Grace Whitfield, the human liaison I had met weeks earlier, was present as well, patched in remotely through the single emergency channel humanity had been permitted to retain. "You understand our position," Thessa said to her, without preamble. "The quarantine you accepted so readily is falling apart, not because your species has broken it, but because ours failed to anticipate conditions your species negotiated years in advance." "I understand your position," Grace said, her voice calm and unhurried across the connection. "I would also point out that nothing occurring right now violates any term of the ruling this council passed. Every crossing has followed an existing clause. Every piece of technology behaving unexpectedly was purchased, installed, and licensed, according to Concord procurement law. We have broken nothing, Administrator Orn. We have simply allowed your own systems to behave exactly as they were always designed to." "Then help us," Thessa said, and I heard something in her voice I had never heard from her before. Something close to genuine desperation. "Help us close these gaps before this entire structure collapses into something none of us can control." There was a long pause on the line before Grace answered, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not expected from someone I had only ever known as calm and unbothered. "Administrator," she said, "we spent 20 years asking to be treated as equals within your council, and we were refused, every single time, through procedure, through delay, through quiet dismissal, dressed up as diplomatic caution. We do not intend to spend the next 20 years fixing a structure that was never built to include us fairly in the first place. What is happening now is not our doing. It is simply what remains, once the parts of your system that depended on our patience are finally allowed to stop. The line went quiet after that, and no one in the room spoke for a long time. I looked at Thessa, expecting anger, and found instead something closer to a slow, dawning recognition, the look of someone finally seeing the full shape of a picture they had only ever glimpsed in pieces before. "They are not attacking us," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "They are simply refusing to hold us up anymore." I thought of the Steadfast, still sitting patiently on the boundary line, broadcasting its calm, careful record for anyone willing to listen. I thought of the seeds, the software, the quietly transferred engineering firms, all of it built years in advance, all of it perfectly legal, all of it waiting, like a held breath, for exactly this moment to finally be released. For the first time since the vote had passed, I found myself wondering whether the Council had ever truly been in control of any of this, or whether we had simply been playing our part in a plan far older and far more patient than any of us had ever imagined possible. Within a month of the first unauthorized crossing, the quiet trickle of activity along the quarantine boundary had grown into something the Council could no longer describe as isolated incidents. It had become a pattern, steady and undeniable, and patterns are far more difficult to argue against than individual events. The Ithra were the first to file a formal petition demanding a review of their entire relationship with the Concord. Their delegation, led by a soft-spoken elder named Kessa Moon, stood before the Council and read a statement that had clearly been prepared with great care. "For 3 generations," Kessa said, "our people have depended on Concord protection in exchange for trade concessions that grew more unfavorable with every renewal cycle. In the past 2 years, our agricultural output has increased by a measure our own scientists cannot fully explain, thanks to cooperation with human researchers, working entirely within the bounds of our existing agreements. We do not wish to abandon the Concord. We wish only to renegotiate our place within it, on terms that reflect what we have actually gained, rather than what we were once told to expect." The Meal filed a similar petition 2 days later, followed shortly after by the Koru Van, whose statement was shorter and considerably more direct. Their representative, a stern-voiced administrator named Torv Kell, simply stated that continued reliance on outdated Concord medical infrastructure, when independently functioning alternatives clearly existed, was no longer something his government was willing to justify to its own citizens. I watched these petitions arrive one after another, each one polite in tone but unmistakable in its underlying message. 3 of the Concord's most loyal client species were quietly, methodically stepping back from the structure that had governed their lives for generations, and they were doing it using language borrowed almost entirely from human legal precedent that had been carefully built into their own treaties years before any of this began. Thessa called an emergency strategy meeting, attended by senior staff from every major department, myself included. The mood in the room was tense in a way I had rarely experienced during my years of service. Delegates argued over possible responses, ranging from immediate military reinforcement of the boundary to emergency renegotiation of every client treaty currently in question. No consensus emerged. Every proposed solution ran into the same wall we had encountered weeks earlier, a legal structure so carefully built that any attempt to reinforce it in one place caused it to weaken somewhere else entirely. "We need direct engagement with the human delegation," Thessa finally said, cutting through the noise. "Not through remote channels, in person. We need to understand what they actually want before this situation escalates any further." The request was sent through the single emergency channel humanity still maintained, and the response came back faster than anyone expected, along with a condition none of us had anticipated. Humanity agreed to a meeting, but only aboard the Steadfast itself, at the boundary line, with no more than 3 Concord representatives permitted to attend. Thessa selected herself, Odrin Vass, and, to my considerable surprise, me. "You have been closer to this than anyone else on staff," she told me privately, before the shuttle departed. "I want someone in that room who has been paying attention from the very beginning." The journey to the boundary took less than a day. I spent most of it staring out the small viewport of our transport, watching the Steadfast grow larger against the dark backdrop of open space. Its hull marked with a design language I still did not fully understand. Functional, and unadorned in a way that somehow felt more deliberate than any elaborate warship I had studied during my training. We were received aboard with a courtesy that struck me as almost unsettling given the circumstances. A young officer named Henry Cole guided us through corridors that felt smaller and more lived in than any Concorde vessel I had ever boarded, past rooms with soft lighting and simple furniture, nothing like the imposing command architecture I had expected from a ship capable of unsettling an entire galactic council simply by sitting still. We were led into what Henry called the common room, a modest space with a low table and simple chairs, where Captain Daniel Carter, the same sharp, quiet man who had led the human legal team during the original drafting process, rose to greet us. Beside him stood Grace Whitfield, and to my genuine surprise, Laura Bennett as well, the very woman who had accepted the banishment vote so calmly all those months ago.
"Thank you for coming," Daniel said, gesturing for us to sit.
I imagine this feels somewhat strange given everything that has happened. It feels, Thessa said carefully, taking her seat, like standing at the edge of something we no longer fully understand. Daniel nodded, unbothered by the bluntness of her statement. Then let us try to make it clearer. Over the next several hours, in a conversation I recorded carefully in my own private notes, humanity's representatives laid out, calmly and without any apparent satisfaction, the full shape of what had actually happened. "You must understand," Laura said, "that we never expected fair treatment from this council, not because we believed you were cruel, but because we understood, early on, that a species without established standing has very little leverage in any negotiation. Every treaty we ever signed was written from a position of weakness. We accepted that reality, and we built accordingly." "Built what exactly?" Audrin asked, his tone carrying more caution than accusation. "Redundancy," Grace said simply. "Every contract we signed, every piece of technology we sold, every trade agreement we helped negotiate on behalf of our neighbors, all of it was built to function independently of continued Concorde approval. Not to harm anyone, simply to survive without permission, in case permission was ever taken away." "And the banishment vote?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "Was that the moment you were waiting for?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "The vote was not something we wanted, Ambassador Veskar. But we understood, long before it happened, that a council under enough political pressure would eventually reach for the simplest solution available, and the simplest solution, for a species with no allies and no voting bloc, is almost always removal. We prepared for that possibility, not because we hoped for it, but because we could not afford to be surprised by it. And now," Thessa said quietly, "your preparation has unraveled half the infrastructure this council depends on." "Not unraveled," Grace corrected gently. "Revealed. Everything that has happened over the past month was already true before the vote passed. The seeds already existed. The software already ran independently. The engineering contracts had already changed ownership. The vote did not create any of this. It simply removed the only reason anyone had to keep pretending it wasn't there." I sat with that statement for a long moment, feeling its weight settle over me the way the earlier reports had, piece by piece, until the full shape of it finally became impossible to ignore. "What do you want from this council now?" Audrin asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine uncertainty I had never heard from him before. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Laura before answering. "Nothing, Chairperson Vass. We do not want reinstatement. We do not want an apology. We simply want this council to understand, clearly and without confusion, that we have no intention of crossing that boundary, ever, unless crossed against first. Every system we built to survive without your permission was built to endure quietly, not to provoke a response. If this council chooses restraint, we will remain exactly where we are, exactly as we have been since the day that ship arrived. And if this council does not choose restraint?" I asked. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his voice grew quieter, more deliberate. "Then the same systems that have caused so much difficulty over the past month will simply continue doing what they were always designed to do. We are not asking for permission to defend ourselves, Ambassador. We built the ability to do so quietly enough that we would never need to ask." The meeting ended not long after, without resolution, without agreement, without any clear path forward that either side could confidently describe. As we returned to our transport, I glanced back once at the Steadfast, still sitting exactly where it had been since the day it first arrived, calm and patient, broadcasting its careful record on an open channel for anyone still willing to listen. Thessa said little on the journey back, staring out the viewport with an expression I had never seen on her face before, somewhere between exhaustion and quiet, reluctant respect. They never needed to win the vote, she said finally, almost to herself. They only needed us to cast it. I did not answer her, because I had no answer to give. I only watched the small, unremarkable shape of the Steadfast shrink slowly behind us, and I found myself thinking, with a growing certainty I could not quite explain, that whatever came next would not be decided in any council chamber, no matter how many green lights appeared on the screen above it. The council did not choose restraint immediately, and the weeks that followed our meeting aboard the Steadfast taught me exactly how much damage could be done by a body still convinced it held more control than it actually did. Odrin Vass, despite everything he had witnessed firsthand, returned from that meeting determined to reassert Concord authority over the boundary, rather than accept the quiet limits humanity had described. He argued before the full council that any further unauthorized crossings should be met with direct interception, regardless of the client treaty clauses being invoked, and regardless of the strange technical failures that had plagued our fleet since the quarantine began. We cannot allow a single ship sitting on a boundary line to dictate the behavior of this entire council, he said, during a session I attended as part of the ongoing technical advisory team. Restraint in the face of open defiance is not diplomacy, it is surrender. I understood his frustration, even as I disagreed with his conclusion. The council had spent generations accustomed to being the largest, most established power in any negotiation, and the sudden reversal of that dynamic, however quietly it had arrived, was not something easily accepted by beings who had never had to consider the possibility. The council authorized a reinforced fleet presence along the most heavily used sections of the boundary, with orders to intercept and turn back any unauthorized crossing, regardless of the treaty clauses being cited. I remember reading the authorization with a growing sense of dread, certain that we were about to discover, in a far less controlled setting, exactly what humanity's quiet redundancies were truly capable of. The first test came only 3 days later, when a convoy of meal vessels approached the boundary, carrying what their manifest again described as essential agricultural supplies. A reinforced Concord patrol, positioned specifically to intercept this exact scenario, moved to block their path, weapons systems active, formation tight and disciplined. I was monitoring the encounter remotely, along with several members of the technical advisory team, watching sensor telemetry update in real time as the patrol closed the distance. For a moment, it seemed as though the interception would proceed exactly as the council intended, a clean, controlled demonstration of restored authority along the boundary. Then, without warning, every targeting system across the entire patrol formation began reporting the same graceful degradation we had first observed weeks earlier. Weapons arrays sliding into standby mode, navigation systems reverting to a passive holding pattern, communication arrays switching automatically to a wide, open broadcast frequency that could not be overridden by any command we sent. The meal convoy passed through the boundary unimpeded, their own systems reporting no interference whatsoever, while the Concord patrol sat motionless, unable to do anything but watch, broadcasting its own internal status openly for anyone monitoring the encounter to see. I remember the silence in the monitoring room after the convoy disappeared from sensor range, the patrol slowly regaining full function only once it had retreated a safe distance from the boundary. No one spoke for a long moment. There was nothing threatening in what had happened. No weapon had fired. No ship had been damaged. And yet the demonstration had been more thoroughly humiliating than any direct confrontation could have been, precisely because it had required no aggression at all. Odrin brought the incident before the council himself, his earlier confidence considerably diminished. The patrol was not attacked, he admitted. It simply stopped functioning as intended, exactly as it had during the earlier incidents, and resumed normal operation the moment it withdrew. Then we increased the force committed to future interceptions, Brasky-Loon argued, still unwilling to accept the pattern forming in front of him. A larger fleet, better prepared, cannot be neutralized so easily. The council authorized exactly that, a far larger fleet presence, drawn from 3 separate sectors. positioned along the most contested stretch of the boundary, with orders to hold the line regardless of any technical interference encountered. I remember watching the deployment unfold on the monitoring feeds, an impressive show of coordinated force that, under any other circumstances, would have appeared overwhelming. The result was the same, only larger in scale. As the fleet approached the boundary in response to another unauthorized crossing, ship after ship began experiencing the same quiet, graceful failure. Weapons systems reverting to standby, navigation arrays switching to passive mode, communication channels opening automatically to broadcast full internal status for anyone watching. The entire deployment, hundreds of vessels strong, sat effectively immobilized along the boundary, while a small handful of client convoys passed through without incident. Throughout this entire demonstration, the Steadfast remained exactly where it had always been, still broadcasting its calm, unchanged message, still refusing to move from its position at the boundary line, despite the chaos unfolding around it. I found myself watching that small, patient ship with something close to awe, understanding, finally and completely, that its stillness had never been passive at all. It had been a statement, repeated over and over, that humanity's restraint was a choice, freely made and easily withdrawn, and that everything surrounding it, every failed interception, every quietly opened channel, was simply the visible edge of a much larger, much older decision they had made long before any council vote ever forced their hand. Thessa summoned me to her office the evening after the second failed deployment, and I found her staring at a datapad displaying the full casualty report from the encounter. A report that, remarkably, listed no casualties at all, no damage, no injuries, no destroyed vessels. Simply hundreds of ships sitting motionless for several hours before quietly regaining function once the situation resolved itself. "There is no precedent for this," she said, setting the datapad down. "Every conflict I have studied, every historical record I have reviewed, involves damage, loss, some measurable cost paid by both sides. This has cost us nothing but our confidence, and yet it feels heavier than any battle I have ever read about." "Perhaps," I said slowly, "because it was never meant to be a battle at all. A battle assumes both sides are trying to win something. I do not believe humanity is trying to win anything here. I believe they are simply trying to make certain that no one else can force them to lose." Thessa was quiet for a long time after that, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a weariness I had never heard from her before. "Do you understand now, Veskar, why they thanked us for that vote?" I thought about it carefully before answering. I believe I am beginning to. "Explain it to me," she said, "because I find I no longer trust my own understanding of any of this." I considered the question for a long moment, gathering together everything I had witnessed since that first quiet vote in the council chamber. The calm acceptance, the careful annotations, the patient ship at the boundary, the quietly transferred engineering firms, the graceful, bloodless failures that had humiliated an entire fleet without a single shot ever being fired. "They built a rule for themselves long before we ever forced them to state it," I said finally. "We do not fire first. We do not build anything that can be used against us without our permission. We do not need to defeat anyone, because we have made certain, quietly and legally, that no one can force a defeat upon us either. The banishment vote did not create this rule, Administrator. It only gave us the first real opportunity to see it in practice." Thessa did not respond immediately. She simply sat there, looking at the darkened datapad on her desk, and I understood, watching her, that the council she had served faithfully for so many years had just been shown, as clearly as it was ever likely to be shown, the exact shape of the mistake it had made, without ever fully realizing it was making one. Outside, somewhere along the quiet boundary line, the Steadfast continued its patient, unchanging broadcast, and I found myself wondering, for the first time since this entire situation began, whether the council would ever truly understand what it was watching, or whether it would simply keep testing the same wall over and over, refusing to accept that the wall had never been built to keep humanity out at all. It had been built, from the very beginning, to keep the rest of us honest about exactly how far we were willing to go, and exactly what it would cost us to find out. After the second failed deployment, the Council quietly abandoned any further attempt to enforce the boundary by force, though no formal statement ever admitted as much. Instead, A strange, uneasy stillness settled over the entire situation, one where client convoys continued crossing under their protected clauses, the Steadfast continued its patient watch, and the Council busied itself with committees and reviews that produced no meaningful change in the actual state of affairs. It was during this quiet period that I received an unexpected message through the same emergency channel humanity had maintained since the beginning, a personal invitation, addressed to me directly rather than routed through any official Concord office. Grace Whitfield had requested a private meeting, once again aboard the Steadfast, though this time without any of the tension that had surrounded our earlier visit. Thessa approved the visit without hesitation, telling me only that if anyone on staff had earned the right to understand what was actually happening, it was the one person who had been paying attention since before the vote was ever called. I traveled to the boundary alone this time, escorted by the same young officer, Henry Cole, who greeted me with the same easy courtesy I remembered from before. He led me not to the common room where the earlier meeting had taken place, but to a smaller, quieter space near the rear of the vessel, where Grace sat alone at a simple table, a pot of something warm steaming gently between us. "I appreciate you agreeing to this," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I thought you deserved a conversation that wasn't filed under any official record." "You have my full attention," I said, taking the seat across from her. Grace poured a cup of the warm liquid and slid it toward me, a gesture so ordinary and human that it felt strangely out of place, given everything surrounding us. "May I ask you something, Ambassador?" I nodded. "Do you understand yet why we accepted that vote so calmly?" I thought of everything I had witnessed over the preceding months, the careful annotations, the quiet redundancies, the graceful failures that had humiliated an entire fleet without a single act of aggression. "I believe I am beginning to," I said. "You built your survival into systems no vote could ever touch, long before the vote was ever called." "That is part of it," Grace agreed. "But it is not the whole answer." She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "For 20 years, Ambassador, we asked to be treated as equals within this council. We followed every rule, honored every treaty, offered every concession asked of us, and still, we were treated as a minor irritation to be managed, rather than a partner to be respected. Every negotiation started from a position where we had to prove ourselves worthy of consideration, while species with far less to offer were welcomed without question." "I do not deny that history," I said quietly. "When the banishment vote passed," Grace continued, "it was, in a strange way, the first time this council ever treated us as significant enough to require a formal, unanimous response. It took the threat of our removal for this council to finally acknowledge, however unintentionally, that we had grown into something worth taking seriously. We did not celebrate the vote, Ambassador. We simply recognized it for what it was, the closing of one long, frustrating chapter, and the opening of another where we would no longer need anyone's permission to be exactly what we already were." I sat with that for a long moment, turning the warm cup slowly in my hands without drinking from it. "And the ship?" I finally asked. "Why does it remain here, still, after everything that has happened?" Grace smiled slightly, though there was no triumph in the expression, only a quiet, tired patience. "Because a rule that is never demonstrated is only a promise, Ambassador, and promises are easy for others to doubt. The Steadfast sits here not to threaten anyone, but to prove, plainly and consistently, that restraint is a choice we are capable of making every single day, under every kind of pressure your council has tested us with so far. It is not a warning. It is a record, built one quiet day at a time, that we meant exactly what we said from the very beginning." I thought of the looped message I had listened to so many times since the ship first arrived, the calm insistence that humanity had crossed no line, requested no exception, given no one a legitimate reason to respond with force. I understood now, more clearly than I had before, that every single day the Steadfast remained motionless was itself a form of communication, patient and undeniable, aimed not at the Council's fear, but at its conscience. "What happens now?" I asked. "If this council never fully accepts the shape of what has happened here?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "Then nothing further happens, Ambassador. We do not require your acceptance to continue existing exactly as we are. The client species who have already stepped away from full dependence on this council will continue building their own path forward, with or without formal Concord blessing. We will remain here, exactly as we have been, for as long as necessary. Patience, as you may have noticed, is not something we run short of. I left that conversation with a clarity I had not expected to find, understanding at last that humanity had never needed the Council's approval to accomplish what it set out to do. It had only needed enough time, quietly applied over enough years, for its own careful preparations to finally become visible to everyone watching. On the return journey, I found myself reflecting on Thessa's earlier words, the observation that humanity had never needed to win the vote, only needed us to cast it. I understood now that this was only half the truth. Humanity had needed something else as well, something far more difficult for any established power to grant willingly. They had needed time, and they had taken it patiently, year after year, quietly building beneath a council, too confident in its own permanence to notice what was being constructed directly beneath its feet. When I returned to my post, I drafted a report for Thessa, summarizing the conversation as faithfully as I could, though I found myself uncertain how much of what I had learned could ever truly be captured in the dry, careful language the Council preferred for its official records. Some understandings, I was beginning to realize, could only be reached by watching quietly, patiently, exactly as humanity itself had done for 20 long years before any of us ever noticed what they were building. 6 months passed before the Council formally reconvened to reassess the banishment ruling, and by the time that session finally opened, the galaxy the Council believed it still governed had already changed into something few of its members were prepared to recognize. I was asked to present the technical briefing that would open the session, a task Thessa handed to me with quiet confidence, rather than the reluctant assignment I had received so many months earlier. I stood before the full assembly, the same chamber where the original vote had passed with such little resistance, and delivered a summary of everything that had unfolded since that day. The Ithra, Meal, and Koruvan governments had each, over the preceding months, formally restructured their relationship with the Concord, retaining membership in name while shifting the overwhelming majority of their trade, agricultural cooperation, and technical infrastructure toward direct partnership with Earth. None of these shifts violated a single existing treaty. Each one had simply followed the quiet legal architecture built years in advance, now fully activated and functioning exactly as designed. The quarantine boundary itself, once intended as an absolute wall sealing humanity away from the rest of galactic society, had been quietly repurposed by Earth into something closer to a voluntary checkpoint, one where trade continued to flow steadily in both directions, governed now by agreements humanity itself had proposed and largely controlled. The buoy network the Council had built to enforce isolation now functioned, in practice, as the very infrastructure enabling humanity's continued, careful engagement with the wider galaxy, on terms Earth had quietly written into place, long before anyone understood what those terms would eventually mean. Perhaps most remarkable of all, humanity had shown no interest whatsoever in seeking readmission to the Concord as a full voting member. When Odrin Vass, still serving as chairperson despite the many difficult months behind him, formally proposed reversing the original banishment ruling, the response from Earth's delegation, delivered once again by Laura Bennett, was polite, measured, and entirely unexpected. "We appreciate the Council's willingness to reconsider," Laura said, addressing the chamber with the same calm patience she had shown during the original vote, "but we must respectfully decline the offer of reinstatement. We have found, over these past months, that our current arrangement serves our people well, and we see no reason to return to a structure that required our compliance without ever fully extending us its trust." The chamber fell into a stunned quiet that reminded me, in its own strange way, of the silence that had followed the original vote so many months before. A species offered readmission after a period of forced isolation was expected to accept gratefully, to seek reintegration, to work toward restoring whatever standing it had lost. Humanity, once again, did the opposite of what every precedent suggested it should do. Braskiloon, still as sharp-voiced as ever, though considerably more subdued than he had been during the earlier sessions, rose to address the chamber directly. "Then what?" he asked. "Does humanity actually want from this council, if not membership, not restored treaties, not any of the things every other species has ever sought from us?" Laura considered the question carefully before answering, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet certainty I had come to recognize from every human representative I had encountered throughout this long, strange series of events. "We want nothing from this council, Delegate Elune," she said. "We have simply asked, from the very beginning, to be left to build our own path, on our own terms, without needing anyone's permission to do so. The banishment vote, whether this council intended it or not, gave us exactly that. We do not resent the vote. In many ways, we are grateful for it." I was called upon once more to offer my own assessment before the session closed, and I found myself standing before the same chamber that had cast that fateful vote so many months earlier, understanding, finally and completely, the full shape of everything I had witnessed since. "Council members," I began, "I believe we have spent these past months searching for the moment humanity defeated us, some clear point of conflict where a plan was executed and a victory was claimed. I do not believe that moment exists, because I do not believe humanity ever sought a victory of that kind. What we witnessed instead was patience, applied so carefully and for so long that by the time we finally recognized its shape, there was nothing left for us to do but observe it, quietly, from the sidelines of a decision we no longer fully controlled." I paused, gathering the final thought that had been forming in my mind since that long, quiet conversation aboard the Steadfast so many months before. We did not lose a war to humanity, council members. We simply cast a vote, confident in our own authority, without ever considering that the species we sought to banish had already built every door it would ever need to walk through calmly, on its own terms, long before we ever thought to close one behind them. The session ended without further resolution, the council quietly agreeing to leave the current arrangement in place, unwilling to risk another confrontation it had already proven, twice, it could not win through force. I left the chamber that day and made my way, as I had grown accustomed to doing, toward the long viewing window that overlooked the distant edge of the quarantine boundary, now humming quietly with the steady rhythm of trade convoys, moving freely in both directions. Far in the distance, faint but unmistakable on the sensor display beside the window, the Steadfast remained exactly where it had always been, patient and unchanged, its calm broadcast still repeating the same careful message it had offered since the very first day it arrived. I thought of Grace Whitfield's words from that quiet conversation months earlier, the observation that a rule never demonstrated is only a promise, easy for others to doubt. I understood now, standing alone before that window, that humanity had spent this entire long, strange chapter proving something far more significant than any single victory could have shown. They had proven that patience, applied consistently enough, over enough years, could accomplish what neither force nor persuasion had ever managed to achieve. They had made their rules obvious, not through declaration, but through demonstration, day after quiet day, until the rest of us finally had no choice but to see them clearly. I filed my final report on the matter that evening, closing it with a single line I could not bring myself to remove during editing, though I suspected it would sit uneasily with whoever eventually reviewed it. "We did not banish a threat," I wrote. "We banished the one power patient enough to let its own removal become the very thing that finally set it free. And then we simply waited, as we always seem to, until it was far too late to understand what we had actually done.